Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
It was a mini-summit of sorts, this meeting in Iceland between superpower leaders Reagan and Gorbachev. But what was accomplished? At first, it looked like perhaps nothing, but now we're told perhaps there was some significant results come out of this meeting. But then there's the problem of disinformation. The White House has leaked some information regarding its operations against the Libyans, and the credibility of the White House all of a sudden is being called in question by some of its opponents. Who are we to believe in government today? Addressing some of these issues regarding the summit and government credibility are Ball State University professors Earl Kahn, who is chairman of the Department of Journalism at Ball State, Tom Sargent, professor of political science at the university, and John Rouse, who is producer of Public Affairs Roundtable and a member of the political science faculty. Tom, I don't know, how do you rate this meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan? I guess in the history of summits, is this something of significance, or was this just a passing of two ships in the night?
Well, I wouldn't call it passing two ships in the night. I think that it was a real summit. It may have been billed as a sort of interim or preliminary or something of that sort. As it turned out, it probably was a summit in the sense there won't be another one for a while. But the two sides met and discussed, and the two leaders of the superpowers met and discussed, and it was a very significant meeting in my judgment.
It had a lot of press beforehand. It had a lot of press afterward, and they met but for only a few hours. Did it live up to its billing? And in the analysis, I guess, is it put us in a direction towards some agreement in terms of arms?
2 points. One is, no, I don't think it lived up to its billing, because the billing was that not much was going to happen. What would happen was a kind of agenda setting for the meeting in Washington, or a meeting in the United States. Might not have been in Washington. In fact, what happened was that there were a number of quite significant agreements that were reached. In the end, the final sticking point was the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. But before that, the two leaders had really made some significant steps in resolving major differences in arms control. So my point is that no, it didn't live up to its billing, but it was an important meeting nonetheless.
Tom, I think that, it's difficult for us here, perhaps in Indiana, to put all this into perspective. After all, for the last 45 years or so, we have had 45 years of peace. We have not had 45 years of war. Prior to that time, there had been several wars in Europe, for example. And so I think it's difficult to put it into perspective. Essentially, don't we have here two conservative politicians? In a sense, Reagan is obviously the representative of our own country, and it seems to me that Gorbachev is not only a representative perhaps of an ideological system, but perhaps more recently he's representative of a state bureaucracy. He was part of the state security system, I believe. So in a sense, point number one I'd like your opinion on, we have two conservative individuals at work, and they are representative of two very different kinds of systems, are they not?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's absolutely right. These are two men who are ideologically quite conservative, oddly enough, and certainly Gorbachev represents this enormous and incredible bureaucracy and political system that moves very cautiously and carefully. Second point I'd make in that regard is that clearly they are also commanders of enormous power, that they do have the power to destroy the world. They're very aware of that. I don't think there's any question about that, and therefore they move with extreme caution. You don't see either the Soviet Union or the United States making rash moves various places in the world in which they might come into conflict or confrontation with the other. There's a very cautious sort of feeling and probing that goes on. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. They have two conservative politicians with two have states in a way, dealing with each other very carefully.
Earl Kahn, your observations on Reagan's outcome?
Well, I think President Reagan has won a considerable political and propaganda victory at Reykjavik. Consider, if you will, what is not being discussed about SDI now. Will it work? There's a great amount of evidence to suggest that SDI either will not work at all, or if it works, will only be, even its strongest adherents claim only something like, ultimately 10 years from now, 90% success. That still means 10% of all the Soviet missiles get through and probably largely destroy the United States. And yet suddenly that is no longer a subject of discussion. Will SDI work? That's been removed from the agenda very successfully. Consider that we're no longer talking about extending war into space. At one time, one of the goals of the United States was that war would be, if nothing else could be said, at least it would not be extended into space. That is no longer being discussed. It's no longer an issue. I noticed that, so I think on both of those points, Reagan has been eminently successful. Consider also that President Reagan, if you picked up in his language, is now talking about SDI as being a shield for the free world. Earlier, the discussion was that it would be a shield for the United States. Now it's a shield for the free world. That suggests that, in fact, SDI will shield the entire globe because there are elements of the free world everywhere. That practically is, I think, in the eyes and minds of most scientists, impossible. And yet he is not challenged on that point.
Earl, if I could interrupt, explain to us, because some of our listeners might not, what is SDI? What does that stand for?
Strategic Defense Initiatives, which is popularly referred to as Star Wars.
And the Star Wars shield somehow is supposed to shoot down the weapons.
Shoot down the weapons as they are shortly after launch, which of course does nothing for the Europeans because those missiles are on target in a matter of moments, not a half an hour or something. And I think if I would add one other point where I think, and I'm not saying that Reagan has orchestrated all this, I don't know whether he did or not, but I think this is the outcome of it. Another thing that he's been very successful in accomplishing in one way or another is that the opponents of SDI have been painted into a corner. If you're opposed to SDI now, you're on the side of the Soviets. And so I think the SDI has, that whole argument has been advanced dramatically through these events with no evidence that it will work.
Well, the Soviets have added a great deal of credibility to the SDI argument, have they not?
I think, my next point would be that I think the Soviets have a propensity towards self-destruction. I can't imagine how they could done anything that would more successfully move forward SDI than what they did at Reykjavik. If Gorbachev's goal is to stop SDI for whatever reason, he could not have moved more dramatically in the opposite direction.
Well, what his goal surely is, though, is to negotiate halting SDI rather than forcing domestic opposition to halt it. And I haven't heard anybody who has disagreed that it was SDI that brought the Russians this far in the bargaining process. And if you look at what was accomplished, what was agreed to at Reykjavik, then you have to say that SDI has been enormously successful in that regard. Also, the final point is we don't know that it won't work. I agree, we're almost certain no guarantee that it will, but we don't know that it won't either. And what we're proposing is, of course, the country's proposing is that 10 years down the road we'll have something.
But what would stop SDI more effectively? Gorbachev's opposition or opposition within the United States? And I would argue that opposition within the United States would more effectively stop it. That opposition is going to be very difficult to maintain now if you appear to be lined up with the Russians.
When you talk about a political victory for Reagan, you're talking about a victory of philosophies, a victory of approach, more so than a Republican Democratic.
Oh, yeah, it has nothing to do with it.
But it's mainly, as Tom points out, it's a bargaining chip, isn't it? I mean, as theoretical as it is, it has the Soviets concerned.
Because the Soviets clearly regard it as a major threat. And they've conducted themselves for the last several months, and certainly in the last weekend in that regard.
In self-destruct mode.
Well, maybe.
Are you saying then that Reagan, we have the topic of disinformation coming up in a few minutes, is he already guilty of disinformation?
I'm not saying that Reagan is guilty of anything. I'm saying that the outcome is what I believe the outcome is what I've described. Whether President Reagan and his advisors set out to accomplish those goals or not, I couldn't begin to speak to that question. I think, nevertheless, they've been accomplished.
That implies such deviousness in a way, and such...
And I don't charge that.
Yeah, I'm saying that to charge that, and I know you were not, Earl, but to charge that would imply such deviousness and such premeditated calculation that I just find that pretty hard to believe. I don't think we're capable of that sort of thing.
I cannot help but believe that as we talk about these issues, we look at them in simplistic kinds of terms, and those leaders, like Reagan and Gorbachev, they have to look at it in a very global kind of perspective, and you talk about the technologies of weapons working and will they not work. You can talk about intermediate missiles versus the long-range missiles. And so here we have a problem in terms of bureaucracy, a couple of problems. First of all, in terms of staff and line, an old topic of mine, you have the line person who is Gorbachev and Reagan has to depend upon the expertise of these people who can tell them that missiles will go so far and will do certain things. So it's a very difficult kind of decision, I would think, for a generalist, which is what a president or the leader of the Soviet Union is, to make a decision upon. You also have a Soviet Union that developed from a very ideological point of view 65 years ago with Lenin and the charisma of Lenin and the ideal of communism not working out. And here you have, for the first time, you have a leader of the Soviet Union that is a product not of the ideological party system, but a product of the bureaucracy. And this bureaucracy in the Soviet Union is suffering. It's breaking down because it's not working after 65 years. So it seems to me that we have, it's not as quite as simplistic as we seem to make it today.
I don't think anybody's suggesting it's simplistic, John. What I would propose is that in any kind of meeting of the kind of person you described, generalists in this case, the President and the General Secretary meet to establish certain principles. We've agreed that we will eliminate all intermediate range missiles in Europe, in fact globally, except for 100 on each side. That's the kind of principle that is enacted. We're going to reduce, over the next 5 years, 50% of our strategic missile capability, and then in the following 5 years, we'll do 50% more. Now, that is a terribly complex, incredibly difficult project to undertake because of the varying kinds of weapons involved. But what the two leaders did was say, this is the principle. This is what we want to do. Now you, the bureaucracy, the defense experts, the armaments experts, you get on with it and get that job done and call us back in 6 months. We'll have another summit in Washington and we'll sign the agreement. That's the kind of thing. That's what we've done at Vladivostok with Ford and Brezhnev in 1975, 74, 75, in that period. And that was what I think could have happened last weekend, except for the problem with the SDI.
These numbers really don't mean anything, do they?
On the contrary, I think they mean a great deal.
Oh, I mean, isn't this really symbolism? I mean, when you're talking about nuclear warheads on each of these missiles, and you're talking about multiple nuclear warheads on these missiles, aren't we just talking symbolism? I mean, whether you have 100 or 100,000 missiles really makes no difference.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that the numbers do mean something, particularly in the sense that, particularly to the extent that we had really significant cuts discussed over this past weekend. And I'm not saying that was the first time those have been discussed. All of that had come up at Geneva before and been put on the table at various times in various formats. But last weekend, some really significant cuts were. You cut 50%. In fact, you agreed in principle to cut 100% of your strategic missiles. You've done something. That's a pretty nice cut. It's too bad that it's going to be delayed a bit.
Larry, I think another thing happened at Reykjavik that perhaps leads into the topic of information, and that is that it's generally acknowledged, I think, that the Soviets had taken a quantum leap forward in their public relations capabilities and abilities. We're accustomed to Soviets over the years being quiet, silent, refuse to discuss issues with the press. No such thing as a press conference, for example, in the Soviet Union. Yet there at Reykjavik was Gorbachev holding forth for an hour before an international audience of journalists. I think it's correct to say responding to questions. There were Soviet officials leaking information and backgrounding in the best American tradition of how to handle the media. The Soviets were smiles and conversationally. By everyone's standard, I believe, they have gone a long way toward developing their ability to work with the world media. And we need to really clean up our act, it would appear, not to catch up, that's not correct, but to at least stay even or ahead of the
Keep
Soviets.
up with it.
Yeah.
Well, this is a very positive thing, because I think what we're seeing is a country that is not as ideological as it used to be. In a sense, it's still ideological, but Reagan now believes that the Soviet Union is a multi-dimensional society, and the fact that they can have a press conference and have disagreements perhaps indicates that.
Well, I would applaud their steps in this direction wholeheartedly. I only observe that it has occurred.
Isn't this not Gorbachev coming forth as the leader, his leadership in the Soviet Union? Hasn't he made that difference?
Well, I think so. There is generally a breath of fresh air within the constraints of the whole system. I think John pointed out a while ago, there are constraints because of the system, the bureaucracy and the apparatus. But I think it's a breath of fresh air. You got two septuagenarians who passed on within a couple of years of each other just before him, and clearly get something now in his 50s. That's nice, and it's different, and it's kind of exciting for them all. I'd like to make one point about credibility. Nobody said anything about the fact that on Sunday night, people were sort of negative, and this was a failure, and yet by Monday evening, when the president spoke, and then at his other public appearances in the last 48 hours or so after the meeting, things got a bit better. And Secretary Shultz was also pretty negative, it seemed to me, and Reagan was very negative, Donald Reagan. I'm wondering if we aren't seeing a very interesting phenomenon here, and that is the phenomenon of fatigue. You remember those guys, not the president, but the others had negotiated from 8 in the evening until 6:30 in the morning. And then they presumably gone on to be alert to and up with the president and the general secretary for the rest of that day. And I'm wondering if what looked pretty gloomy after roughly 24 hours of discussions without sleep looked a bit better after a full night's rest and reassessment of what had happened.
Perhaps frustration that something immediately that they didn't accomplish everything they had set out to, but on reflection there was something more there than...
There's credibility there, though, that interests me. I mean, I can see people saying, well, that's not credible, they've changed their tune, they're saying something different now. And I submit to you that there may be that kind of fatigue problem.
Well, I think there's a fatigue problem, but I also think that on November 4th of this year coming up, we're going to have a political election, and after all, the Republican president cannot come back from the summit and say everything's negative. But in terms of looking at this issue, we still have the problems of verification, and we still have the problem that essentially we're dealing with a closed society. And although there are some positive things to report, as Earl has said, that's a concern.
Well, let's talk about the issue of verification of what your government leaders tell you. We have the flap over disinformation, and when we look, as we will be, at this more public relations-minded Soviet government vis-a-vis the open society of the United States, and who is it you believe and who is it you don't believe? Certainly the Reagans will be telling us that the Gorbachevs cannot be believed, and certainly the Gorbachevs will be saying the same thing of the Reagans. Who do we believe now? Has the United States government, through these leaks about Libyan operations, not hurt the credibility of the White House, of the administration?
If that question's directed
That's to you,
me, I think the answer is yes, but I think it's something difficult to measure. There, no doubt, within the next several days, there will be opinion polls of American attitudes, whether they have changed or not toward government and what have you. And it'll be interesting to see what those show. I think we can suspect what they might show. But I believe there's a deeper, more significant, but more difficult to measure question involved, which is difficult to get at in a poll, and that is a gut-level perception toward your government. I can recall vividly still when Eisenhower told us as President of the United States that there were no such things as U-2 planes. And then the Russians said, well, that's very interesting. Here's one we shot down. That, in my recollection, in my lifetime, was the most vivid memory that I have, that I was aware that my government would lie to me. Now, many people have pointed out that all governments all lie, and I think we all intuitively know that, and we even understand it and accept it to a certain degree. but there's something about disinformation that I think troubles us as a people deeply. And I suspect we'll never really know the full implication of what this disinformation program has meant to the American people.
Earl, if I could bring that on home in terms of making the point, Senator Lugar, of course, is chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's obviously from Indiana. And that was the point that he was making. He has a quote. He says that I think our greatest strength is still that we tell the truth as a government. And so as we look at this issue with Gorbachev, and we have to focus upon the truth, and he, of course, called this disinformation policy, quote, stupid, end of quote. And, of course, John Poindexter, who is head of the National Security Advisor for Reagan, is also from Indiana, so we have two Hoosiers here. The issue is one of truth, is it not?
Well, Bernard Kalb, in his statement to the press, said, "Faith in the word of America is the pulse beat of democracy." Now, that's a striking statement and maybe a melodramatic statement, but it's still, there's something there, I think. What happens when your faith is eroded? As I've heard the comments of Reagan and others about Reykjavik, I have taken them for what I think they're worth, propaganda statements. I'm not sure when my faith in the word of America, if ever, will be totally restored.
Well, let me just raise this from a slightly different perspective. I think we're talking about two different things, at least two different things. On the one hand, to refer to your last point with regard to Reykjavik, clearly a government leader is going to come back with the most positive outlook that he can possibly muster. There's no question about that, and that's the way it ought to be in a way. I mean, he's saying, this is what we did, and it's positive, and isn't it wonderful, and we'll go on now to do something else. Too bad the other fellow didn't agree, and so forth. A second perspective would be with regard to something like the Eisenhower comment, U-2. First of all, unfortunately, in my judgment, the President Eisenhower admitted too readily that he knew about the U-2 incident. In my judgment, it would have been preferable for him to have denied any knowledge of that, so that that summit meeting, which was broken up, as you recall, in 1960, could have gone on and not been destroyed, because it was clearly very difficult for Khrushchev to sit across the table with somebody who had said, yes, I knew there was a plane flying over your country, and there are going to be some more, that sort of thing.
And I think
the final point I'd raise, John, is that those two incidents, those two kinds of credibility problems are different from the sort of deliberate misinformation that a government or a government agency sends out to mislead and to, in fact, in this case, in the case of Gaddafi, to destroy a government. I think that's a tough one. That's a difficult thing to undertake. I know George Shultz's comment about, well, I'd like to make him a little nervous. I don't mind that at all. That's okay, but that's a short-term view in my judgment. You want to take a little longer-term view of the problems of telling the truth, even abroad.
Well, I was going to pick up on that point, because where does information begin or disinformation end? Because Gaddafi has been compared to the Nazis, and of course they quoted Winston Churchill and how Churchill thought it was good to have some disinformation for the Nazis in terms of when the troops were going to land for D-Day. Is there not some argument to be made for disinformation when you're dealing with anti-democratic personalities such as Gaddafi?
Well, Churchill made it, of course, and was quoted by Schultz, if I remember correctly. So most people would not disagree with that. You certainly don't announce to the Germans when you're going to invade France, and you try to keep them off stride as to when the invasion will actually take place. I think everybody can understand that. It's a thing that's difficult to get at, I think. What is the difference between that and a deliberate disinformation program to mislead Gaddafi? And, of course, when you do so, you mislead the American press and you mislead the American people. There's no way to separate them.
And the contexts are different, though, too. And on the one hand, we're talking about, and some would argue, but on the one hand, we're talking about total war between the forces of right on the one hand, the forces of evil on the other. On the other hand, you're talking about a second-rate dictator who is creating some terrorism in various points of the world. Now, I agree that to the person who's injured or killed by the terrorism, the differences are subtle. But there seems to be, there is still a difference in context.
The American press is really smarting from this, though. I mean, in the Soviet Union, the press is, in fact, an agent of the state. It is used by the state for the state's purposes. So we pride ourselves in having a free press here in the United States that is independent of the government, and the press feels a little bit used when it's lied to, and its own credibility suffers, and it blames Reagan.
You see a little bit of both. You see the press feel that it's been used and disappointed, in other words that you could supply. You also find what I would call the harsh cynicism of a Nicholas von Hoffman, who says, what do you expect from government? Of course you expect to be lied to. And if you read his column recently, he noted that if government lies to me once, that's their problem. If I buy it, if they lie to me the second time and I buy it, that's my problem. I should expect government to lie. You find various responses on the part of the media.
And I guess I question, would the Reagan administration perhaps have decided to do something differently had it been early in his first administration? Did the Reagan administration say, well, we don't have to worry about re-election here, so maybe we'll play around with the press a little bit. Maybe we'll use the press so he gets done. What can it hurt us? Maybe we'll use this tactic.
I think that could well be, but I think of all the news that's come out about the disinformation program, to me the most disappointing bit of the most disappointing news occurred within just the last day or so when it was leaked, I guess, that the FBI has named a team, a special FBI team, to try to find out who gave that disinformation story to Bob Woodward of the Washington Post. So the concern is not what have we done to the American people. The concern is find out who leaked that story and get him. That is disappointing, I feel.
Yeah, that's the focus of any bureaucracy, is to focus upon security, whereas democracy and individuals, so in our society we have two values, and sometimes one wins out over the other.
You can believe us when we say we're out of time for today, though. I'd like to thank my panelists today, Tom Sargent, Earl Kahn, and John Rouse, for being with us and their contributions here. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of...